Did you know how many ways the Great Barrier Reef is being killed or damaged? 45 and still counting. But which way is the silliest of them all? Some of the early worries about the Great Barrier Reef were perfectly plausible. So, for example, when science first started on the reef in the 1960s and they discovered plagues of coral-eating starfish, it made sense to worry about the reef. Now, decades of research has indicated we should probably worry about other things, but it made sense at the time. However, there are other threats which look completely ridiculous right from the beginning. In this episode, we're going to look at the most ridiculous one of all. It is scandalous not just because it doesn't make any sense scientifically. It's also the way that after it was completely proven to be an erroneous threat, in other words, the science behind it turned out to be wrong, it was essentially covered up by the major science institution that was responsible for it. It's been quoted in all the major government reports, and it's also had misleading evidence given in a major Senate inquiry to the Great Barrier Reef. Please like and subscribe. So, the number one ridiculous threat to the Great Barrier Reef is coal dust blowing off harbour loading facilities, drifting up to 200 kilometres out to the Great Barrier Reef. One eminent scientist then went even further and said the entire 2,000 kilometre length of coast was being affected from this harbour coal dust. Now, this was all based on 15 samples taken up to 200 kilometre from Australia's biggest coal loading point at Hay Point, Dudgeon Point. The nearest part of the Great Barrier Reef is 100 kilometres away. That's the nearest part. But there is actually very little coal dust coming from these conveyor belts and coal loaders. They go to a lot of effort to wet the coal to suppress the dust. After all, people have to work next to these coal loaders. And if you're affecting coral 200 kilometres away, then it's going to be lethal for workers to work right next to the machinery. And it's not like the area around the port is covered in dust. It's actually got beautiful greenery all around it. It's hardly the polluted wasteland that it's going to have to be if you're affecting the reef 200 kilometres away. Now, it is true that in the past, coal dust was a real killer of miners who worked down mines, and even today, in countries with very poor regulations, black lung disease is a huge problem. But this is after usually years of massive exposure. Coal is actually a relatively inert rock, essentially. It is not terribly poisonous like cyanide or arsenic, which will kill you in minute concentrations. But the funniest thing about all this is that there's actually quite a nice little coral reef living right underneath the piers of the coal loading facility. It's not one of the reefs of the Great Barrier Reef, it's only a little thing, and it's an inshore reef, so the coral is not as beautiful as it is out on the Great Barrier Reef. But before I was fired from James Cook University, we actually did quite a lot of work on that coral reef, and there is great coral and there is stunning aggregations of fish. So if this reef is so incredibly healthy, how can the coal dust be killing the Great Barrier Reef 100 to 200 kilometres away? In addition, it is very likely that the scientists who made these claims, their analytical methods were not even specifically measuring coal dust. In fact, the scientist was measuring a group of chemicals called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. We'll call them PAHs for short. Now, coal contains a lot of PAHs, but PAHs are very common chemicals. So, to quote an early book on this subject, PAHs are ubiquitous substances. They are found in terrestrial and aquatic plants, in soils and bottom sediments, in fresh and marine waters, in emissions from volcanoes, and naturally occurring forest fires, and in the products of numerous human activities. It turns out that even barbecue grilling a steak will make PAHs. But bushfires produce vast amounts of PAHs, and it ends up being attached to the charcoal and soot in the fire. Now, this is Australia, and there have always been very major bushfires in this area. They produce millions of times more materials than the tiny amount of dust that's blown from the coal loading facilities. PAH chemicals are not specific to coal, and the scientists involved had not taken enough care to determine if the coal was actually what she was measuring. So right from the beginning, this work looked highly suspicious. Now, it turned out that other people thought the same thing. The author of the work published a correction to her paper shortly after she first published it. It referred to a criticism by a scientist from the CSIRO, one of Australia's preeminent science organisations, who had apparently disagreed with her methodology and contacted her in private. At first glance, it looked as though Burns had fixed all the errors in her work, which he implied were not very major anyway. I was surprised by this, but had a fair idea who the CSIRO scientist must be, and sure enough, it was Dr. Simon Apte and his co-workers who had contacted Burns. And Simon Apte is a world-class chemist who, unlike Burns, has specialised in pollution measurements for decades. He showed that Burns had made some really monumental errors, especially with the calculations. Some of the concentrations of PAHs were too high by 1,000%. Her whole methodology was wrong, and none of the concentrations of PAH were of any concern. To quote Apte, "The consequence of the above errors is that the risk posed by PAH is based on the recommended ANZAC approach is seriously over-exaggerated, and it is the responsibility of scientists to ensure that sound data are presented to government inquiries dealing with such issues." Now, 1,000% error might seem like the worst part of this story, but it's not. When Burns published her correction, she failed to fix the 1,000% error or acknowledge the problem that PAHs are not specific to coal. She just fixed a few things which actually were not much greater than typos. So Apte, who I suspect was seriously displeased by this failure, decided to write to the scientific journal that published the paper in the first place and made a full rebuttal. But quite incredibly, the journal refused to publish Apte and co-workers' correction, despite their incredible experience in the field. They buried the problem. So Apte's commentary remains unpublished, except for as an appendix in my book. But not only did the journal cover up the problems, the science institutions where Burns worked when she collected the data, the Australian Institute of Marine Science, also failed to release a statement retracting the work when they became aware that it was erroneous. The whole thing has been buried, and one could speculate this is because it is all too embarrassing. This work caused huge headlines. The coal industry is right at the centre of a political focus. And here was some work proving that not only was coal causing climate change and therefore damaging the Great Barrier Reef, but it was also damaging the Great Barrier Reef directly. There were calls to effectively shut down all the coal ports on the Queensland coast. For example, one eminent scientist, Professor Hughes, director of the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for Coral Reef Studies, told a 2014 Australian Senate inquiry, no less, into the Great Barrier Reef, coal dust has spread hundreds of kilometres from ports. It has now accumulated everywhere on the Great Barrier Reef, not just near dredging sites or near ports themselves, and is exceeding toxic levels in nearshore location. I think this new evidence is sufficient that recently issued permits to undertake dredging should be revoked. Well, if a port cannot dredge its channels, then it will eventually silt up and have to close. This would then close well over half of Australia's coal exports, its second biggest export industry, on the basis of a few dodgy measurements and erroneous calculations. If ever there was a need for a little quality assurance, this has to be it. Note also that Professor Hughes, who led what some would regard as the second most prestigious coral reef research organisation in Australia, stated that coal had accumulated everywhere on the Great Barrier Reef. Now, in fact, not even Burns stated this. So he took Burns's already exaggerated concentrations of 1,000% and then exaggerated the area by another 1,000%. And this work by Burns, despite being published in 2014 and being shown to be wrong, is still being quoted in highly influential reports. It was in the 2017 Scientific Consensus Statement on the Great Barrier Reef. So hundreds of scientists effectively endorse the work, even though I'm quite sure only a tiny few actually read it. It was also quoted in the 2019 Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority Outlook Report, and more recently in 2020 in the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, effectively a United Nations thing. It was made pride of place in the section on the effect of coal dust. So to sum up, coal dust, which is not a particularly poisonous subject, has supposedly reached the entire 2,000 kilometre length of the reef by blowing often against the wind and moving often against the current from what is a relatively tiny source at Hay Point Terminal. The measurements were triflingly few and have been proven by expert chemists to be totally incorrect. The bogus work has not been retracted by science institutions despite them being well aware of the errors. They have covered it up. The work has been latched onto by groups of scientists, including those calling for the shutting down of Australia's second biggest industry. This work does not show the Great Barrier Reef is threatened by coal dust, but it has proven without any doubt that some institutions studying the Great Barrier Reef have zero commitment to scientific integrity. It is one thing for an error to occur, that is inevitable, but for it not to be corrected and then used continuously in a highly charged political debate by the scientists themselves, this shows the true depth of the problem that we have with our institutions. Well, thanks for watching. If you want more information, they're in the Plato GBR website below. And also, if you have suggestions for topics you want us to cover in the future, put those in the comments. We read all the comments. Thanks very much.